We are continuing our conference. At this moment, we begin the panel, System Thinking for Tackling Wicked Problems. So, I am very honored to introduce Professor Gerald Midgley, an excellent professional and a great person too. Thank you, Professor Midgley. Let me read a brief biography for the professor. Gerald Midgley is Professor of System Thinking in the Center of System Studies, Faculty of Business, Law and Politics, University of Hull, UK. He also holds adjunct professorships at Sweden, Australia, and New Zealand. He has held research leadership roles in both academia and government, having spent 10 years as a director of the Center of System Studies at Hull and 7 years as a senior science leader in the Institute for Environmental Science and Research, New Zealand. He has written over 300 papers, and we read some of them, very interesting, and edited 11 books for academics and practitioners on system thinking and community operational research. He has involved in a wide variety of public sector, community development, health service, technology for science, and resource management projects. So it's wonderful to hear your talk now, and we are happy to attend your lecture. Please, Professor Midgley, start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen. Okay. Let me just start by thanking you for the invitation to this conference. And it's really nice to be among old friends. It's just a shame that this year it was not possible to come to Brazil. Now, when I was discussing with Marcos what I was going to present on, we sent ideas backwards and forwards, and we agreed on the topic that I'm going to present tomorrow. But in the process of having that discussion, he said, oh, I'd really like something introducing systems thinking. So I said, but that's not specifically related to university entrepreneurship. He said, it doesn't matter, we can make the links. So I've got a presentation to introduce systems thinking, and that's what I'll give now. And I'll just make a few notes at the end about how this might be relevant to university entrepreneurship. So I want to start by talking about wicked problems. The term wicked problems has been around since the 1970s, and it's commonly used in policy circles for meaning really difficult problems, highly complex, characterized by conflict and almost impossible to solve. And if that's the kind of problem that we need to deal with, and I'm saying systems thinking could help us with that, then the next question is, what is systems thinking? So I'll give you a brief introduction to systems thinking, and then I'll talk to you about different systems approaches for different purposes with practical examples. And those practical examples are drawn from some of my own projects in both the UK and New Zealand. And I'll end then with key principles for a flexible and responsive systems practice. Now, one caveat I want to state right at the start is that there's been 100 years of research on systems thinking, and it's been applied in every possible discipline, from physics and biology through to family therapy and management and policy. And it's not possible to cover even a fraction of that variety. So I'm just going to focus on policy and management as application areas. And it's worth mentioning that in 2017, the United Nations, the WHO, World Health Organization, and the OECD, they all called for a systems approach to deal with highly complex problems, and especially for working across and integrating the Sustainable Development Goals. So back in 2017, that brought a lot of attention to systems thinking. And now we're actually seeing really increased interest in it across government, industry, and NGOs. So let me start the talk proper by discussing wicked problems. So the term wicked problems was actually first suggested by a systems thinker, Wes Churchman, and picked up then by Rittel and Weber, who wrote a famous paper that is still widely used today. So the characteristics of wicked problems are up there on the screen. It's highly interlinked issues, multiple agencies, multiple scales, many different views on what the problem is and potential solutions, conflict often over both what a decent outcome is and how to achieve those outcomes, power relationships making change different, uncertainty and skepticism about the possibility for change. A lot of people talking about having to manage wicked problems, not actually solving them because they're so heavily entrenched. Now, if that's what a wicked problem is, and certainly governments are handling a large number of wicked problems, and we're living in the midst of one of them right now with the pandemic, then how can systems thinking actually help with that? Well, to answer that question, I want to spend a little bit of time just answering the basic question of what is systems thinking. So the term systems thinking can be broken down into two parts, thinking and systems. And I want to start with thinking first. So thinking uses language. Language is socially shared. So dialogue helps us to think. So the kind of idea of thinking I want to use is a broad one. It's not just what goes on in your head. It's also what goes on in discussions between people. So thinking is both personal and collective. That's important because most systems approaches welcome participation, stakeholder participation in one way or another. Now then, what is system? Well, here's a basic understanding of system. And if you have a look at the diagram I've got on the screen, I'm hoping you can see my cursor. The boundary I'm pointing to here represents the boundary of a system. Within it, there are several parts to that system. Those parts are joined up with relationships. So we have here already three ideas of systems thinking. One is that a system has a boundary. You can differentiate what's within it and what's outside it, what flows across that boundary. It has parts that cohere into a whole, and those parts are related together. And the system itself is also related to other systems outside it. Now, one of the key things about systems is that they're also always seen from a perspective, which is why I have this little woman here on the left-hand side looking at the system. You'll notice, though, I've also put this woman into the system, right in the middle of the system there, because as soon as you start to engage with any system, whether it's an organizational system, an ecological system, social system, you become part of that system. If it's got a wicked problem, you become part of that wicked problem. So your situation is not neutral. You have a perspective on it. You cannot have a God's eye view of the system. You always have a partial perspective on it. Now, when I think about the large variety of work in systems thinking, I need some kind of framework to organize that work. And in 2008, I had a lucky coincidence. I was sent a paper by a a now colleague, Derek Cabrera, who's now at Cornell, and he wrote quite an iconoclastic paper about how systems thinking has become far too complex. There are far too many different methodologies with their own systems languages. It's become far too complex to understand that language of systems, and we need to reduce it to some very basic, simple ideas that are nevertheless very powerful. And he talked about how we can think in terms of 4 systems thinking skills. So here are the 4 systems thinking skills he proposed. He talked about boundary distinctions, how we distinguish what is within our purview, what we're looking at, and what we're excluding from consideration. Issues of relationship, so how do things connect causally with other things? Issues, the systems idea itself, the idea that system is made up of parts in relationship, and it's those parts and relationships together that form the system and mean that that system has properties that you can only attribute to the whole. You can't attribute them to any one part of the system. If you think about the thoughts going on in your brain right now, you can't say that your brain can achieve those thoughts on its own. It needs a body as well. It's a whole system. The brain can't survive without the body. And then there's perspectives as well, exploring multiple perspectives, because no system can be seen as in an absolutely objective way. The participant within the system always has a perspective on it. So here you have, drawn from the notion of system itself, 4 systems thinking skills: thinking about boundaries, exploring relationships, understanding systems, and appreciating different perspectives. And what those 4 skills help us do are to think more critically in a wicked problem situation. And there are 2 senses in which we think more critically using the systems ideas. First of all, it brings attention to these 4 aspects of a system when we might only be consciously aware of one of them initially. So we might be looking really strongly at relationships and mapping causality. And we forget to look at perspectives. We forget to see that some relationships look highly complex from one perspective, but they look very simple from another perspective. And maybe that's why you have a problem. So it brings attention that there are other ways to look at a system. You can begin to explore its perspectives. You can begin to think about the different boundaries that you could use in understanding the system. But there's also a second way that it brings critical thinking. You can always look for alternatives. So let's say, let's take the example of boundaries. Maybe a company that is logging a rainforest is using a very narrow boundary there about what matters to that company, which is maximizing production, making profits. If you broaden that boundary, you can begin to see that climate change matters, that biodiversity reduction matters. Likewise, you can see that different relationships might matter, that different emergent properties of the system might matter, that different perspectives might matter. So you have that kind of critical thinking about systems. Now, the original paper by Derek Cabrera talked about let's dispense with all this methodological language that is just very confusing because there are so many methodologies, and let's get down to this basic understanding, which is actually very flexible because you can combine these skills in an infinite number of ways in practice. Well, he's right, you can combine these skills in an infinite number of ways, and it is extremely powerful. But I also realized when I saw this that it helps to make sense of what different systems methodologies do. So instead of throwing out the methodologies, what we can do is begin to understand how they use the different systems thinking skills. Now, all mature systems methodologies use all 4 of the systems thinking skills. So it's not just about saying there's one methodology for boundaries, there's one methodology for relationship. It's not like that. What it is like, though, is that each of the methodologies tends to prioritize one thinking skill over all the others. It has a dominant skill that it utilizes. And by understanding that, we can understand what methodologies might help us with our thinking and with our dialogue and planning. Now, since having that idea, I've got together with Derek and Laura Cabrera, and we're now writing a book on this. So you're having a sneak preview, if you like, of some of the ideas from this book. So there are basically 4 kinds of systems approaches. There are approaches for exploring value and boundary judgments about what you should include or exclude from analysis, also what gets marginalized. There are approaches for understanding complex causality, where things like feedback become important and where you can start modeling, doing computer models, for example, of systems and begin to anticipate possible consequences of intervention. There are approaches to developing viable and highly responsive organizations, maybe at multiple scales, ranging from global right through to local. And there are many approaches for understanding different perspectives, for addressing conflict, helping to develop better mutual understanding between stakeholders, and helping to agree solutions that people are willing to implement. So what I'm going to do, given that there are hundreds, literally hundreds of methodologies, I'm just going to give you one example from each of these categories, which will give you a flavor of the variety of systems ideas. And it will be no more than a flavor. If you want to start studying it in depth, you'll see there's endless variety. So I'm going to start here with approaches for exploring value and boundary judgments. To talk about this a little, I'm going to do something rather naughty, which is compress 50 years of research on boundaries into 5 minutes of my presentation. So you'll understand that what I'm giving you is just something very basic. And I'm going to introduce you to this, this visual modeling language of boundaries. So the ellipse you see here is representing a boundary. That means whose views are included and what issues are included. Also, naturally, what is excluded and whose views are excluded. Now, what helps to draw the boundaries are the purposes and values that people pursue in a situation, which is what this peak represents, value judgments. When we talk about evaluating university entrepreneurship, for example, notice the word value is there in evaluation. So values are not general principles like kindness and mercy. They are specifically linked to what matters to people in the context of action. So inevitably, helping us explore our values helps us think about what boundaries we ought to draw in any one situation. So what stakeholders we should include and what issues we should be focusing on. Now, Wes Churchman, who was the first person to think in these terms, thinking of boundaries not just as physical, real-world demarcators of what's in the system and outside, like the skin of my body is a boundary on a physical system. Wes Churchman said you need to think of this conceptually, what is in and out. And he talked about the most ethical approach being to expanding the boundaries as far as possible, but without compromising analysis by over-inclusion. So he talked about the most ethical position being the broadest possible one. And he really talked here about how you can explore values as a way to understand different possible boundaries. Now, that was during the 1960s and 1970s. In the 1980s, one of his students, Werner Ulrich, picked up this idea, and he said, it's not so easy just to expand the boundaries. In practice, there are a lot of practical constraints on expanding boundaries. And in any case, if we think generally about systems thinking, one of the assumptions that every systems approach makes is that everything in the world is either directly or indirectly connected with everything else. So really, if you want to expand the boundaries, you're going to be doing that indefinitely. And you just cannot include the whole planet in absolutely every analysis you're going to do. That's not going to be practical. So there's a different question you have to ask, and that is, how do you rationally justify the setting of boundaries? And he gave an answer to this. Now, his answer to this is quite philosophical, and perhaps you didn't come to this presentation to hear a philosophical explanation, but I'll give you an abbreviated version because it's quite important. So Werner Ulrich said that, that because we use language in order to have any kind of rational justification, and language is socially shared by people, you then have to look at the people who are involved in and affected by the situation you're looking at. And what it means is that something is justifiable if it has been agreed in dialogue with all those involved and affected. Now, that's a high standard of rationality. And he said, we might not be able to attain it in every situation, but at least we can justify when we have to close off debate. And at least we can aim towards being as participative as possible with those who are involved and affected. One of the other ideas that Werner Ulrich talked about is how every boundary judgment is limited. It is impossible to have that God's eye view. And if we're partial in two senses. We're partial in the sense that we can't be comprehensive, and we're partial in the sense that what we look at is informed by our values. And so actually accounting for those values is important. Now, because we need to practically explore those boundaries, Werner Ulrich developed a tool which asks 12 simple questions about what the system currently is and what it ought to be, which you can use in dialogue with people. And I've abbreviated them on this chart here. You can see that there are 4 kinds of questions. They fall into 4 categories. There's questions about motivation, or what should the purposes be? Who should benefit? Questions about control. Who should have decision-making power in a situation? What should decision makers control and what should they not control? Questions of expertise. Who else should be involved and in what roles? What counts as expertise? So, for example, I've done a project in a prison. Now, does the experience of being a prisoner in prison count as expertise? And legitimacy. Who's affected but not involved, and should they be involved? Should those affected be free to opt out of the system? Again, that's really important if you're working in a prison, for example. Should prisoners be free to opt out? Probably not if they've committed serious crimes. And what should be the core values and assumptions? Now, we can use this in 2 ways, these questions. We can use this for collective planning, trying to secure an emergent agreement on key purposes, values, boundaries, and especially governance, because these questions help with governance. But if decision makers are refusing to listen, then citizen groups can use these questions to clarify their own viewpoints and to begin to build a polemical argument to push their own agenda. So it can help spark dialogue when dialogue is being interrupted by decision makers who don't want to listen. Now, I'll just give you one example of using this tool from my own practice. So I did an evaluation back in the early 90s of one of the first projects, which was diverting people with mental health problems from prison and from police cells. The idea was that people with mental health problems should be receiving treatment and not be simply punished for their crime. So a service had been set up to help find the people with mental health problems in prison and help get them appropriate treatment. Now, we did this evaluation, and what we found is that the project was quite successful, but there were two types of people who were not getting a service from it. There were people who committed serious crimes because there were no facilities locally for mental health treatment for people who'd done serious crimes. So those people were left in prison. The other category is people who were not responsive to drug treatment because there were no non-drug treatments like talking therapies available to the people. So those people ended up staying in prison. So we asked the question, can you redesign the criminal justice and mental health systems within the locality we were working to prevent this problem arising in the first place, to make sure that people didn't need this service? They actually didn't end up in prison when they have mental health problems. They have some alternative system. And we use those critical systems heuristics questions to ask what the system ought to be, also using design principles so that the design had to be technologically feasible, it had to be viable to implement, and it had to be adaptable so you don't build some kind of new super bureaucracy that just causes more problems in the longer term. And through this process, we worked with people who'd been in prison who had mental health problems, and we worked with professionals in the criminal justice and mental health systems and did a redesign of the whole process, showing what kinds of services are needed to address the problems. And the Home Office, which is the main government department that has an oversight of criminal justice, made special mention of this methodology, saying it needs to be used more in these kinds of situations. Now, I'm just going to go back for a second to this diagram. You remember what I said about this? The ellipse represents a boundary, who's included and what issues are included. The peak represents values. Now, we can also use this way of diagramming things to represent marginalization. So this looks rather complicated, but I'll talk you through it. So we have here a narrow boundary judgment made by one stakeholder group, and we have a wider boundary judgment made by another. Let's say the narrow boundary judgment is made by an organization who looks after the welfare of its own employees. They've got good ethical human resource management, but they're not interested in local unemployed people in the community. Then maybe the second boundary judgment is made by a campaign group who really believes that that organization owes a debt to the community and they should be employing more people who are unemployed. Now, in that situation, you have two boundaries, one around the organization, one around the whole community. And the people who are marginalized in that situation, the issue of unemployment itself. So we have two values here, looking after our own employees and looking after the whole community. They come into conflict. And what happens when you get that kind of conflict is that you begin to get an imposition of strong value judgments on the people who are marginalized in this situation. And I call those value judgments made sacred. People are made sacred or profane. So profane means that they're derogated, they're devalued. And you can see that when you talk to people in that organization, because they may start to say, why should we spend our taxes on helping people who are unemployed? They're just lazy scroungers. They take our tax money and they're not working. And on the other hand, you get the campaign group saying, if we can harness the energy of the unemployed, we have a vanguard for a new political movement. They're putting those unemployed people on a pedestal as sacred. And these two interpretations of what's marginalized come into conflict. Now, one tends to get made dominant over the other through rituals in institutions. So one of the things that you see around unemployment is a ritual where people are made to sign a register saying they're available for work. If you've ever been unemployed, and I was in the early 1980s, you know that that's a ritual of humiliation. You're made to line up with other people who are unemployed, and it's basically the system telling people that it's the profane interpretation of the unemployed that is the dominant one. And that's why dealing with marginalization is so important in projects, because when people get negatively marginalized, it can be quite damaging to not just their self-esteem, but their whole status in society. So let's have another example of dealing with marginalization. So I did a project in the late 1990s where we worked with children living on the streets, young people under 16 living on the streets. And the idea was to help design new services to get them off the streets. And we wanted to do that involving the young people themselves. Now, children living on the streets, and we were doing this in Manchester, where there are about 2,000 children living on the streets in any one year. Children on the streets are marginalized in two ways. Because they're under 16, they're regarded as less rational, less able to make informed decisions as adults. They're also regarded as troubled teenagers. If they're on the streets for any length of time, they usually get involved in petty crime, prostitution, drug dealing in order to make some money, in order just to survive on the streets. So we said, how can we actually deal with that marginalization to make sure that we don't just reproduce it in designing new services? So the first thing we did is that we involved young people before the professionals. So we went out on the streets at night, interviewing young people, and we did that for 3 months before we ever even talked to a professional about how the services should be designed. When we did talk to professionals, we communicated the words of the young people, not just our words. This is really important because all of the agencies had the power to turn away and say, no, it's not our business. We needed to have enough emotional experience coming through the words of the young people for it to be impossible for those agencies to turn their backs on the problem. And believe me, when you hear a 13-year-old girl explain what it's like to get involved in prostitution on the streets at the age of 12, it's so emotionally compelling that none of those agencies turned their backs on it. They all committed to helping fund and design services. We use the same design methods with the young people as with the professionals. Now that's important because if we had, for example, done something playful with the young people, and then we'd done proper planning with the agencies, it would be easy for the agencies to say, well, ours are the proper plans, and what the young people has done is very nice, but it's not proper planning. And we needed the two to be comparable. And the outcome of that was actually the adults, the professionals, said that they could implement just about everything that the young people had asked for. We also ensured that the very toughest issues, like accusations of verbal and physical abuse by the police, were tackled. And we had a lovely workshop where we simply handed out quotations from the young people to police officers, and they just read through them in absolute silence. And the workshop didn't need facilitation. The police immediately saw that there was a problem and suggested all sorts of ways in which they could tackle that problem. So there's an example of dealing with marginalization. We were able to make young people central to the design of services that would help them. So let's come back to the 4 systems thinking skills. What about thinking in terms of relationships? Now, the example I'm going to give you is from system dynamics. System dynamics was originally developed in the 1960s by J. Forrester and has been developed in new ways more recently. When you see this pile of spaghetti on the screen here, ignore the detail of it. I just want you to understand the form. The idea here is that you're modeling complex causality. Each of those bubbles is a stock, which means something that you can quantify. Its quantity can go up or down, and each of the arrows represents an influence. So when one stock goes up, the other stock goes down, or when one stock goes up, the other stock goes up. You can use that kind of modeling language to model qualitatively without quantifying anything, or you can build a computer model with quantification in it. This particular diagram comes from a project I did in New Zealand because New Zealand has the highest rate of food poisoning in the developed world, and particularly food poisoning bacteria called Campylobacter. So they wanted to know what is it about New Zealand that has such a severe food poisoning problem. Now, what happened is some of the scientists we were working with published some findings that said the problem is that it's the dairy industry, because cows carry this bacteria, they poo in the water, and that water transmit the bacteria to human beings. Now, this caused an almighty stakeholder conflict because the dairy industry is worth $8 billion to the New Zealand economy. It is the largest export sector in the whole economy, and it actually accounts for more than the exports of everything else put together. It's that important to the New Zealand economy. And the farmers were saying, this is not our problem. They were blaming human sewage, and the stakeholders wouldn't even come in the same room together to discuss it. There was so much anger that the scientists had done this, and it had become front page news on the headlines in the newspapers. So my team was asked, can you help get people talking again? Now, we knew we weren't going to be able to solve the problem in a short intervention, but we did think we could get them talking again. So what we did is we worked with each stakeholder group independently. So the things at the top here are all about the human sewage system. And we got the farmers to explain their thinking about the causality. The things down here are to do with cows. We got the scientists to explain their thinking about causality. And there are lots of other things in here as well, even wild ducks. And then we brought the stakeholders together. Now, by this time, because they'd done their own models, they thought they were in a good position to justify their understanding to others. So they were willing to talk. But when we brought them together, instead of asking them to justify their view to others, we asked them to look at each other's models and find causal connections from things in one model that connect with things in another model. And gradually over a morning, it became one big system. And it dawned on everybody that you can't talk about food poisoning and only look at part of the system. That is just a recipe for one person blaming another. You actually have to deal with the whole system if you're going to deal with the food poisoning. So there's an example of a methodology, system dynamics, that can help model and deal with complex relationships. Now the third one, approaches for developing viable and highly responsive organizations. Now for this one, I want to give you the example of the viable system model, which is a modeling tool developed by Stafford Beer originally in the 1970s, but it's been developed and modernized over the years and still being developed to the present day. It's a model that can be used to diagnose failures in a current organization, or it can be used to design a new organization. And here's the basic idea of it. And people who know the viable system model will know I've vastly oversimplified things, but I'm doing that in order to save time. So imagine this is the environment of your organization. Every organization exists in an environment. And if an organization is going to survive and thrive, it is going to have to meet some needs in that environment. If it's a business, it needs to serve customers. If it's a public service, it needs to serve some elements of the public. So those might be the needs that it serves in the environment. An organization may serve multiple needs. So if that's a university, for example, those might be the different groups of students who want to study different subjects. So you need operational units in order to service the needs. So the first thing it draws attention to the model is how well aligned are your operational units with the needs in the environment. So if this is a university, how well do your courses meet the needs of the students who want to study those subjects? You also need coordination between those operational units. So if, for example, you suddenly have a bigger intake of students on one course and a reduced number of students on another course, you might need to move lecturers from one course to another. You may need to shift the resources around. You need overall management. That means defining the limits within which the system is functioning well. So this is where indicators come in. If this was university courses, what are the minimum number of students you need for viability? And what are the maximum number of students you can have when the course is going to get overloaded and you might need to split the class in two? Now, as long as the course is functioning perfectly well between those two figures, the management can leave it pretty much alone. Only needs to intervene if it transgresses those limits. Any organizational system also needs foresight. It needs to be able to look to the environment and be able to anticipate threats and opportunities, and also look internally in the organization to see if it has the capacity to meet those threats and opportunities. And it needs overall strategy that helps guide the organization and maintain the identity of the organization, helps it continue to do what it needs to do. So, for example, if it's a university, it has its purposes of providing teaching and research, but it doesn't, for example, become a consultancy business and forget that it's its core business. Now, you'll see that there are numbers in there, that I've used numbers to describe this, and not just the words like operations, coordination, management, foresight, and strategy. That's because Stafford Beer made an important point that all of these functions of an organization are equally important. If you take one out, then the others all fall over. That's important because people often work in hierarchies in organizations and think the strategic managers are somehow more important than the people who do the operational delivery. And that's a really serious mistake. And one way to counteract that mistake is to use numbers. Now, you can find this kind of structure in any healthy organization. You should be able to find it at multiple scales. So in a university, you should be able to find that at university's level. You should also find that in any one school, in any one faculty, and in any one class, you might be able to find, any one course, you might be able to find those different functions going on. When I use this approach, it's after I've done explorations of what the organization ought to be doing, because you can actually use this kind of approach to make something that is really socially undesirable more effective and efficient. You don't want to basically make a concentration camp, for example, to use an extreme example, more efficient and effective. So I've used it, I'll talk a little bit more tomorrow about using it to give advice on a public inquiry into family violence in New Zealand, where it was used to look at the family violence service system. I've used it to actually help design my own research group so that it properly reflects the policy priorities of government. But I just want to give you one quick example here. This comes from the project of one of my PhD students, Pam Sidelko, and she was working on the design of an interagency system to deal with international organized crime and its interface with local gang crime in Chicago, because what she noticed is that the international organized crime were recruiting local gang leaders, and in order to prove themselves to the international organized crime organizations, they would get more and more violent. So the two systems that people address separately in government are actually interacting, creating more violence at both levels. And what she did was help the agencies come together and design an interagency system using the viable system model. What you see on the screen here is their understanding of the wicked problem. I'm not going to even attempt to explain what's in this diagram, but it was a whole process of getting to the various aspects, and the colored lines represent where the agency jurisdictions lie and how those overlaps represent areas where you could have teaming up and sharing of intelligence. So you can see, as soon as you overlay the agencies' jurisdictions onto the diagram, there are large areas of the diagram that are not being addressed and large areas of overlap too. And this kind of process helped them work out how they can coordinate more effectively together. Now, the very final approaches for addressing conflict and exploring multiple perspectives. I'm only going to give you one approach again, and this is soft systems methodology, which was first developed in the 1980s by Peter Checkland. And it's a qualitative approach to support people learning about a problem situation and trying to get some clarity in the mess, and do that in a participatory way where you actually explore different perspectives. So it starts by mapping the mess. And you can map the mess visually and get stakeholders together. This diagram comes from a project I did in New Zealand, which was a feasibility study for building a new water storage dam to address drought in an area of New Zealand. Now, you don't have to understand what's in that picture. It won't be meaningful to you, but the people who were engaged in that will understand it. It also doesn't matter if people disagree, because you can build the disagreements into the picture. You can actually picture the disagreements. Now, once you've got that kind of visual representation of the problem situation, you can begin to identify the transformations that people want. And the trick here is not to force agreement on the transformation at this early stage, but to keep multiple possibilities on the table and then help people explore those possibilities so you get a better understanding of different perspectives on what needs to change. And here's a mnemonic you can use to help people understand the parameters of their change. So the T in the middle, it stands for transformation. It represents the change you want. So this is our current situation and we want to get to something else. The worldview underneath that represents the assumptions and values that make that transformational meaningful. And then if you go to the top, the beneficiaries, who's going to benefit, the actors, who's going to make it happen, the owners, doesn't mean financial owners, it means who can stop it working, victims, who can be harmed, and environmental constraints. What do you have to take as given, which might be the law, it might be finances, it might be environmental limits in the ecological sense. You can explore these things to help people understand the transformations that they want and that other people want. And after that, you can begin to map the activities that would be needed to make that a reality. So here's an example. This one came from a project I did in New Zealand with the Ministry of Research, Science and Technology. And they wanted a review of 4 roadmaps for controversial science and technology. That's biotechnology, nanotechnology, energy and environment research. And they had had a lot of stakeholder conflict in setting up these roadmaps. So we mapped, first of all, the process that they used. And this map represents the process. I won't explain it all to you. I'll just draw your attention to one thing, that they set up the draft roadmaps and then took them out for consultation into stakeholder groups and got a lot of conflict. We just helped them make one change, which was to communicate with stakeholders before they pre-framed the roadmaps. So we had the stakeholder consultation earlier, and then the whole thing became a lot less conflictual. Now, once you've begun to map those activities, still keeping multiple options on the table, you can begin to look for accommodations. Now, an accommodation is not a compromise. You don't have to find everybody's giving up something. Neither is an accommodation a consensus. You don't find that everybody agrees on everything. Accommodation is a next step forward, and you can usually agree some kind of accommodation. And an example I want to give you is from a project I did helping 19 organizations come together to design a counseling service that could be activated in the event of a major disaster. We spent 6 days working with them using this methodology, and they designed the counseling system. Those 19 agencies had been working together previously for 18 months and couldn't agree on what this service should look like because they had such different perspectives. And that's a nice example because it actually shows you that this kind of thing is efficient as well as effective. People often say that participative approaches are inefficient, but actually we managed in 6 days what they were unable to manage in 18 months. Now I'm going to close off by just leaving you with 3 systemic principles for managing wicked problems. So the first is we have those systems thinking skills. And one of the things that's important is to explore boundaries, the stakeholders and issues and those values, what conflicts and marginalization exists. Explore those things up front and revisit those kinds of boundaries as you're unfolding things. Now, why does that have to be done up front? That's because you don't even know what stakeholders, what interrelationships, what systems you're dealing with until you've actually explored some initial boundaries. Your second principle is drawing upon and mixing methods from across all of these systems approaches. And you can use ordinary science as well. Now, being systemic is not about the method you use. And that's why I can throw the sciences in there as well. It's about the approach you take to designing the study. That will allow you to be as responsive as possible to all of the dimensions, or as many of the dimensions of a wicked problem. And your third principle is that if you've got no previous experience, start from where you are. Try a new method when the need arises. Take one step forward. and then build your capacity for the longer term. I say start from where you are because actually you've got no choice. If you're already dealing with a wicked problem, you have to start from the skills that you've currently got and take the next step. Now, one last minute spent on reflecting on the relevance of this for university entrepreneurship. One of the things we might want to think about is exploring the boundaries and values about what matters. We might want to think about key cause-effect relationships that matter to the entrepreneurship. We might want to appreciate the different perspectives that stakeholders have on that entrepreneurship. And we might want to think about the various different systems that entrepreneurship involves and affects. So I hope you can see that a systems approach is actually relevant to evaluating university entrepreneurship, even though I only came to that topic right at the very end. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions.
Okay, thank you, Professor Midgley. Excellent presentation. Topics very, very interesting that we have to study more and more in order to tackle wicked problems. Well, I think there is a question. Marcos, did you see there, or do you want to read here? Maybe, Professor?
In the chat?
Yes. Nisia?
I'm not sure he is saying. The question is, I have a question. Since there are many methods representing all these 4 systems thinking skills, is there any paper which address or list some of them besides the examples showed here?
Yeah, there are many papers. If you want the most comprehensive volume that has been produced, there's a set of 4 books called Systems Thinking, and it's 4 books rather than a single paper, I'm afraid. But I produced that 4-volume set precisely to survey the whole field. That will, again, not give you everything, but it'll give you a lot more than is in your in this presentation. And often when I have PhD students starting, the first thing I ask them to do is to read selected chapters from that book, because they're all the classic papers that have been most influential in the field of systems thinking. It's a little out of date now, but the other thing I'll mention is that I'm co-editor of a handbook for systems thinking that will be published in mid-2021. That also will have 40 or so chapters, each with different systems methodologies. So use those resources. Ask your university to buy those books because they're rather expensive. I don't think an individual would want to afford them.
Okay, Professor, there is still another question, which is why do you use the mnemonic Beto instead of Keto, which is more usual? Do you have an explanation for this?
Sure. So I developed that out of Catwo because victims are not explicit in Catwo. So I changed the C from customers to beneficiaries, and I put victims in separately. And I think that's really important because I've seen people use Catwo, and although Checkland says in his book that you should account for victims as well, a lot of people don't do it because it's not in the mnemonic. So I prefer to actually have victims explicit. And then that gets people to think about, well, is this worth it if those stakeholders are going to be harmed? Or should we mitigate the effects on those stakeholders? Or is there some other kind of transformation we need to deal with that? It raises those sorts of questions.
Okay. Can I make a question, Carmen?
No, for me, no. I was thinking about the last question, but it's okay. Mm-hmm.
Okay, Professor, there are both cultural impacts and operational, technical, economic impacts that result from the structuring, the problem structuring. You mentioned some emotional results, both in the case of New Zealand, the food poisoning, the hate you identified, and the problem with younger people living at the street, the emotional contact, or I believe due to affect, to the compassion or the understanding. Is there any methodological way to exhibit both the cultural and the operational technical results?
Sorry, I'm not understanding the question. So are you talking about how to deal with the emotions?
I'm talking about how to be more comprehensive regarding possible emotional and enduring of the changes that occurred.
Yeah. So let me answer that obliquely, if you like, because I think one of the things we have to realize is that people don't change their minds through purely rational arguments. They change their minds through emotional engagement. And there's a systems theory called the theory of autopoiesis that explains this. So we have various different rational domains, different ways of using language, which have logical interconnections. They're closed ways of thinking, and we move between those. And because of that, you need to be able to engage at the emotional level. What I find is that the most transformational projects I've been involved in have always have been quite emotional in the kind of workshops that people have been in. So, for example, with the work with children on the streets, that really harnessed the energy of the agencies. They really saw the reasons for doing this. Sometimes you're dealing with negative emotions from the start, but you can begin to harness that negative energy. So what happened with the engaging with my team that engaged with the food poisoning discussions, initially the stakeholders didn't even want to talk to each other. They just wanted to shout at them, to the media, that this was a problem. And they did it because we gave them a tool that made them actually think they were going to justify their position to other people. But when they actually got into the room, they saw something else unfolding. And when they saw the connections with other people's ways of thinking, they began to understand the emotional rationale from other people's points of view, and the conversation became reasonable. Now, they still disagreed, but it was reasonable conversation. And it's actually quite easy in some ways. I've been in situations where people have been disagreeing, and what I've helped them do is list the value judgments that they're making, list the sets of values, and then ask them to evaluate the options in relation to all of the values and not just their own. And just getting people to think about evaluating something with somebody else's values helps them, helps put that person into that person's shoes, and their minds are opened a little more. And I've seen people actually changing their perspectives through that. Does that answer your question? I'm not sure if it does or not.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Well, if it is possible, one question. I always wonder about the selection of stakeholders. And you show in your conference, in your talk, about the 12 questions from Ulrich. Is that okay? Is it possible to use in the same way in order to select the stakeholders, the correct stakeholders, maybe?
It can certainly help. I don't think it's the only tool that's useful. So one tool that I often use is one by Mitchell et al., Mitchell, Agel and Wood, and it has 3 categories of stakeholder, and they are people who have power. So you're looking for people who have power in the situation, people who have legitimacy, so people would expect you to involve them, and people who have urgency, so they want to be heard. They talk about those 3 categories. I think that's quite useful as well, because then once you actually start talking to the different stakeholders, they're going to have different views about who's got power, who's got urgency, and who's got legitimacy. And you can begin then to expand the set of stakeholders. And what you often find is where they do have different views about who's a stakeholder, for example, who's legitimate, is usually where the conflict lies. So you can begin to get a good picture ahead of time of where the likely conflicts are going to lie by using those 3 categories. What Ulrich contributes with critical systems heuristics, it's not so much the 12 questions, it's the notion of the involved and affected. That's the important bit from Ulrich for identifying stakeholders. So you don't just get those stakeholders who are, let's say, as part of your supply chain, but you think about all of those who are affected, which might be affected by environmental issues or might be affected by social justice issues, and you get representations of those. West Churchman as well talks about thinking about future generations. Now, if you do that, then things like environmental issues become more important. Can you then have somebody in your stakeholder group who is representing future generations and their possible concerns about the environment, let's say? That's even expanding beyond the involved and affected, because these are people who are not yet infected but might be in future. So there are various tools I think you can use for exploring the stakeholders.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Well, Professor Estellita, I see the time.
Yeah, you should close the session. Thank you very much to Professor Midgley and to the audience. And remind people that the works will proceed in the afternoon to look at the program.
Okay. Thank you very much thanks very much for hosting me.
Thank you so much, Professor Midgley. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.